most people, the car represents a dream, an ideal, an object of desire. But it is also a menace, a destroyer, and a killer. How it came to be all those things is not so much a history, but an adventure, a tour through the lives and ambitions of the men who gave us the most popular means of transport ever conceived. And, of course, a look, sometimes critical and sometimes affectionate, but always nostalgic, at the cars themselves, the brands, the marques that make up 100 years of motoring. This is the state of the art. The 1970s Grand Prix racer is the ultimate development of the car as we know it. Although it is not a practical car in the sense that there are only about 10 people in the world who can drive it properly, it incorporates the latest engineering designs and concepts. And yet, there is almost nothing on it, in it, or about it that was not at least conceived more than 70 years ago. It almost certainly represents the end of the line for our present and persistent concept of the motor car. Although people have tinkered with variations that have led off on terminating branch lines, the basic concept of the car has never changed. All right, let's begin with a definition. The automobile that we've come to know and love is a four-wheeled people carriage powered by an internal combustion engine. It should provide reasonable power, powerful brakes, adequate handling, economy, comfort, and of course, safety. In the early days of motoring, no one was able to come up with all of those things in one fully integrated package. The car evolved over a period of time from a number of ideas from a number of people in a number of countries right around the world. Let's see how that happened and how we finish up driving the sort of cars we drive today. Power. What an awesome beast the modern engine is. A heavy block of metal with hundreds of components whizzing and spinning and turning, and capable of putting out a great deal of power. Versatile and adaptable as it is, however, it is not so very different from this. This is the engine that powered what was considered to be the first real automobile. But for me, at least, it's not really a car, for reasons I'll explain in just a moment. It was built by Carl Benz in Mannheim in Germany in 1886, much to the consternation of his neighbours, who were very alarmed by the noise of the thing and the fact that it was self-propelled. It really is a very delicate and amazing piece of engineering design. The more so when you consider that while other people were building carriages and then adding engines, Benz designed and constructed the whole thing, a fully integrated piece of machinery. Integrated and beautiful it may be, but heaven knows what it's going to be like to drive, but I can't resist the opportunity to drive the world's first automobile. The interesting thing about cars with constant speed engines is their lack of ability to climb hills, especially since there's also no gears to play with. It's just a matter of being clutch in or out. And then another interesting situation develops because it won't stop, or at least it won't stop very well, and it means that you really want to keep your speed down, because from my point of view I'm terrified of crashing into things, especially with such a valuable piece of equipment. It's also very hard on the bottom. There are no springs in the vehicle as such, and therefore no suspension, but it has a few springs under the seat just to give you a slightly more comfortable ride, but it's only very slight. And it has exceptionally direct steering, operated by a single tiller, which is also something of a problem. In general terms, however, it's a remarkably efficient little piece of equipment. And all one needs to remind oneself that it is, after all, 1886. When I mentioned the Benz just now, I said that it wasn't a car, and the real reason for that is that it only had 3 wheels. This is a car. It has 4 wheels and it carries more passengers. But if the Benz is a piece of integrated design, this is classically disintegrated. It was built in the same year, 1886, by Gottlieb Daimler, and he commissioned a carriage builder to construct the chassis for him, which is obviously designed to be drawn by a horse. And then, having done so, he installed his speciality, the engine. Daimler had once worked for Otto, and he was responsible in part with Willem Maybach for the establishment of the internal combustion engine, especially on the 4-cycle principle. Let's just describe that. And the 4-cycle principle operates in that the piston, which is sitting vertically in a tube, sucks fuel in on its downward stroke and then compresses it on its first upward stroke, at which point it fires and there is a power stroke, down again, and then an exhaust stroke going back up again. Daimler's specialty. And it led to this, the classic Daimler V-twin, which was to provide a tremendous amount of commercial success for the Daimler organisation. And even then, they were still not building particularly good cars, which they left to the French, who were using their engines. That is until Gottlieb Daimler died and the company was taken over by his son Paul and Willem Maybach. And then they really did get heavily into building some very good Daimler cars. Incidentally, the whole of this developmental work by Gottlieb Daimler and Willem Maybach was done right here in this workshop at Bad Cannstatt, just a mile or so from the giant factory of Daimler-Benz today. The trouble with the early cars was that they had a constant speed engine. These days we're spoiled, not only with infinitely variable speed engines, but also with gearboxes, both manual and automatic, which give us the capacity to handle almost any situation at all. In the early days, with 1-speed engines and no gearboxes at all, a hill of any kind was a terrific problem. I cannot begin to describe to you the ways in which the early designers tried to get the power of their engines to the back wheels. They tried ropes and belts and chains and pulleys and pushies and anything at all that they could get their hands on. But finally, they were all put to shame by a young Frenchman by the name of Louis Renault, who had been playing around with things mechanical for years, and finally, at the age of 21, modified the design of another man and produced in it the world's first true gearbox. That is, gears in a box. He would have sold it, the whole idea I mean, other than for the intervention of his brother Marcel, who said, no, we can make some money out of this, let's develop it ourselves. And as a result, the Renault brothers produced this, their first car for a client. Renault's gearbox was essentially pretty simple. I'd like to be able to drive the car and show you, but it is not drivable, unfortunately. It ought to be, in fact. It simply meant that you had 3 gears and you selected them by pulling this against a spring and turning it until you picked up each of the gears that you wanted. And as well, in the same box, there was a reverse, which was a nice little idea. So, in little more than 10 years, we've gone from Carl Benz producing a beautifully engineered cycle car to Daimler designing the modern 4-stroke and putting it into a 4-wheel car and then to Louis Renault producing a gearbox which gave that car the capacity to go almost anywhere. Although very few people recognised it, the problem developing now was how to stop the thing. This is the XJS Jaguar, and if this car can stop so well, then all cars should be able to stop equally well. The reason that it does is that it's fitted with four-wheel, pressure-limited disc brakes. Jaguar developed a disc brake system on all four wheels for their C-type Jaguar, and with it they won Le Mans in 1953. And they won not so much because they could go faster, but because they could stop better and go on stopping for the whole of the 24-hour race. Let's just try to describe the difference between a drum brake system and a disc brake system. A drum is literally that, a circular drum in which there are two brake shoes. And those brake shoes are actuated by a piston, and they expand and they come in contact with the metal of the drum and thus slow the wheel down. That system generates quite an amount of heat, and drum brakes are badly affected by heat, and as well, drum brakes are difficult to keep in equal adjustment on all four wheels. A disc brake is just simply a metal plate, a disc, grabbed, pinched if you like, by a caliper, which slows the whole assembly down. In fact, it generates more heat, but it's less affected by the heat than a drum brake system, and it's much easier to keep in equal adjustment on all four wheels. I used Jaguar to illustrate the point about brakes because Jaguar was said to have pioneered disc brakes. Pioneered, but not invented. An English genius by the name of Dr. Frederick Lanchester invented the disc brake system for cars and offered them on his cars as early as 1903. But nobody wanted them. And Mercedes offered four-wheel brakes in 1903, but nobody wanted them. And Arrol and Johnson tried again with their cars in 1908 with four-wheel brakes, and nobody wanted them. In fact, it wasn't until the mid-1920s that four-wheel brakes became standard in any form on all cars. I referred just a moment ago to Dr. Lanchester as a genius, and he was certainly considered to be so by his contemporaries. He was, for example, the first person to design an entire car of his own hand, and I mean everything. His engines were different from most people's at the time. Horizontally opposed, twin-cylinder, air-cooled. And they were balanced, or at least they were as close to being balanced as you could possibly get, and that meant a great deal more efficiency and smoothness from the engine. He built into this car an epicyclic gearbox, the forerunner of the modern automatic. Almost fully automatic, and he added a pre-select for second gear, making the first to second shift very quick and positive. He provided a rigid chassis and very soft suspension, thus making his passengers very comfortable, and added to their degree of comfort by locating the engine in the centre of the car, thus giving more passenger space. This particular Lanchester is the 1901 model. And at a time when most manufacturers were not in the least concerned with the comfort of either the driver or their passengers, Fred Lanchester was doing something quite serious about it. Also considering that the roads were very rutted and very rough, this car really is a remarkably comfortable car to ride in. Since it is, I thought it might be a nice opportunity to sit back and relax and enjoy it, rather than go through the complications of actually driving. The handbook on the car said this Lanchester is not a racing car. And that's obviously true. It even went so far as to say it wasn't fast, but I'm not so sure that's true. For 1901, it really is quite brisk, remarkably smooth, flexible, and pleasant to drive in. And it indicates clearly the magnificent achievement of that one man who designed the whole vehicle. In the long term, Dr. Fred was just too independent and too revolutionary for his own good. His backers, much to our great loss, forced him out of the business. Right, by 1903, you could start and you could stop. But what about handling? Well, for the most part, cars were still very slow and handling wasn't a major consideration. And the primary reason for suspension at all was for the comfort of the passengers, but nevertheless, experiments were being made in the area of handling. This is the modern Porsche, and I guess the only questionable feature of the car is its independent rear suspension, which causes problems for a lot of drivers because of the various camber changes which have that marvellous sort of effect that makes it possible to completely spin the car as soon as you come off the throttle. What's happening quite literally is that despite the fact that the car is fairly stiff in its suspension, there is a weight transfer effect. When you accelerate, the nose lifts, and when you decelerate, the nose drops. The back wheels are going through an arc of this nature each time you change that attitude of the throttle. So that, when you back off in the middle of a corner, when you lift off the throttle, the wheels drop into a different tangent and the car starts to slide. And for some people, that sort of slide is uncontrollable. Most early cars provided solid beam axles, like this 1901 Oldsmobile. That means that both wheels are attached to each other. It gives predictable handling, but as you can see, it's a pretty stiff old ride as the wheels rattle over the bumps. Some manufacturers were looking at independent suspension, and although they added comfort to the ride, they were already having the sort of problems which naturally come when all four wheels are interdependent. But there was a solution to the problem of combining soft ride and predictable handling. In fact, the problem was solved before anybody realised that it existed, and yet the solution is very rarely used even nowadays. It was solved by an employee of Albert, Comte de Dion. De Dion was a Parisian with a passion for fast living and an intense interest in fine machinery, and by the mid-1890s he was building the most beautiful cars in partnership with Georges Bouton. The cars, of course, were known as the Dion Bouton. The system became known as the Dion system, and it was made most famous, I suppose, by the fabulous German Mercedes-Benz Grand Prix cars of the mid-1950s, and it's used today on Alfa Romeo Alfetta and Rover 3.5, to name just two. If you think back to the Porsche system, imagine that type of setup, of course much more modern, but that type of setup, but without this tube. And you can clearly see that since the pivot point is there, that the wheels tend to move about that pivot point in an arc, providing fairly violent camber change. Now add the tube, which is all that de Dion did, all that his employee did, not de Dion, and now the axle location keeps the wheels travelling straight up and down, but it still provides the benefits of this flexibility of movement in the transmission and the half shafts themselves. That eventually means that you get all of the benefits in terms of comfort of an independent suspension and the solidity and the location and the predictable handling of a solid beam axle system. For all of their niceties and refinements and the very beautiful way in which they were made, the little de Dions were not exactly easy to drive. A bit tricky, funny little things to do with your hands all the time, very little to do with your feet once you get mobile. Very direct steering, especially if you've got a few bumps to contend with. Even worse in the vis-a-vis position with passengers in front of you. And they don't like hills at all. Comfort and economy are the last of our criteria, and in fact, neither of them were of any concern to the very early manufacturers of cars. They were much too preoccupied with more important things mechanical, for example. And in fact, it's also true to say that comfort is a very personal thing. What I like, you may not like. And therefore, we really can't assess it as such, but economy is a different story altogether. And the name that first springs to my mind when I think of economy is Ford. Not so much for what they build today, of which this Cortina is certainly a classic example, but because of the concepts of Henry Ford when he first thought about building cars. So far, we've only considered developments in Europe, but across the Atlantic, things were happening. The Jurier brothers hold pretty firm the claim to making the first cars in the United States of America. In 1896, they built 13 of them, and they sent 2 of those to England to take part in the London to Brighton Emancipation Rally to celebrate the end of stranglehold legislation on motoring of the day. In the same year, 1896, Henry Ford built his first car in a workshop in Dearborn, just outside Detroit. This workshop and this car. Like all very early designs, it's somewhat crude, but in fact, in terms of engineering refinement, it's probably the equivalent of Carl Benz' first car. Over a period of months, Ford developed the vehicle and then eventually sold one, and then another, and then another, until finally he was quite literally in the business of manufacturing cars. Bearing in mind always that marketing was his principal exercise, he operated in a number of different guises until finally in 1903, the Ford Motor Company came into existence here in the Mack Avenue plant. At almost exactly the same time in England, the Honourable Charles Stuart Rolls and Henry Royce were beginning to form an alliance which was to epitomise the word comfort for all motorists for all time, even if not economy. Even with this, Royce's first complete design, that comfort is apparent and far more so than in any other contemporary work. Henry Ford, Rolls and Royce, Louis Renault, Gottlieb Daimler, Ransom Olds, Fred Lanchester, Louis Panhard, Carl Benz. What we now know as just names from the past were once the names of extraordinary men with a passion for the motor car. And what we now know as just vast companies run by lawyers, accountants, businessmen were once alive with the personality of people whose sole love was the automobile. By 1904, they and their contemporaries had established what we know as the modern car. For the next 30 years, they were to produce some of the loveliest and most intricate designs the world would ever see. And yet, when they died, almost nothing of their individual style remained. That individuality, that personality, the very essence of the word Marque died with them. And I'm afraid we've paid a very high price for letting that happen.